You're listening to The Jacob Valk Show. He's breaking down the latest and greatest in sports as only he can. Follow him on Twitter at RealJacobValk. Here he is, Jacob Valk.
Hello, sports fans! Welcome to another edition of the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and usually when you get closer to the NFL draft, you see the rumor mill churn like crazy. And boy oh boy did the rumor mill churn yesterday, and not soon after, we got a very juicy trade involving Rob Gronkowski going to the Buccaneers to play with his old quarterback, Tom Brady. In exchange for probably the best tight end of this era, all the Buccaneers had to give up was the 139th overall pick. That is a compensatory fourth rounder. It's not their own fourth rounder. Their own fourth rounder is at 117. So they were able to save that pick and give up one 22 picks later. That may not seem like a lot in the grand scheme of things, but think about it this way. If you're a team like the New York Giants, which has been linked to trading back for a lot of this process, would you want to trade down to 26 from 4? No, you wouldn't. That's what the Buccaneers did here. They got a team to forego a pick that was 22 spots higher. I think that's really impressive. Obviously, there's a lot to break down here. I don't even know where to start. My head is still spinning over this trade. I mean, I never thought that we'd see Gronk play football again. He's been very open about wanting to stay retired and the damage that football did to him physically and mentally. This is a guy with a very lengthy injury history. Hasn't played 16 games since his sophomore season, 2011. He's been very active about how much of a toll football took on his mental state. He's used partying as a release for that. Now, it's okay to party if you can go out on Sundays and play. I don't mind that. I don't care if you get home at 4 in the morning in the wee hours of Sunday. You have to get up at 7 or 8 to play a 1 o'clock game. If you ball out on Sunday, that's fine. I really have no problem with that. There are some people that can function on limited sleep. I'm one of them. I have to be. And I'll tell you, as a huge Jets fan, I like Gronk. He's a very likable guy. I'd love to sit down at a bar and have a few beers with him. Could he drink me under the table? Yeah, probably, but it would be fun to go toe-to-toe with him. You gotta give him credit for knowing his body as well as he does. You know, he knew when to step away for a year. He knew that he needed some kind of stress release. I remember old articles saying that Belichick would grow tired of Gronk's antics and he'd want to trade him. He was very close to being traded to the Lions 2 years ago. And Gronkowski threatened to retire rather than play for another quarterback. Him and Brady have a great chemistry. You can see it. Brady's the really serious guy who eats raw vegetables and drinks a ton of water and eats avocado ice cream. Gronk is the party animal. Opposites attract, in the immortal words of Paula Abdul. We talk about Gronk being a big dummy, all he can do is party and play football. I don't think that's true. I think he knows himself really well. He's had a pretty successful post-NFL career. He signed on with WWE and won a belt there. He was their 24/7 champion. In fact, he's still their 24/7 champion. I wonder if he's being brought to the ground if another player can't pin him and become 24/7 champion that way. I mean, I'm not a wrestling fan anymore, but I know what that belt is. I looked it up. That belt is exactly what it sounds like. You can win it anywhere at any time. He's a smart guy, I think. I don't think that notion of Gronk just being a big, dumb Bolvan is fair. I gotta tell you, I think he's gonna do really well for the Buccaneers. Assuming he stays healthy. If he misses 1 or 2 games, okay, you can live with that. I don't think the Buccaneers expect him to play all 16 games. But if Gronk plays like 14 or 15 games, you can expect him to get 800 yards. Somewhere around 8 touchdowns. See, he's not going to be the Gronk of old that people had compared to Tony Gonzalez and Antonio Gates. Once you take that year off from football, something happens to you. You just lose something. I'm not saying Gronk can't be good, but he won't be great. Marshawn Lynch, when he came back for the Raiders, was good for 1 year, but that was it. Jason Witten was good last year for the Cowboys. Wasn't great. Le'Veon Bell was just decent last year. I wouldn't even say he was good for the Jets. Just decent. I don't know what exactly happens to you when you take that year off, but once you do, you take a step back. But to just give up a compensatory 4th rounder for this guy, it's worth it. Especially when you put him in a system with Tom Brady, Mike Evans, and Chris Godwin, coached by Bruce Arians. That's a damn good fit. I gotta tell you, my first reaction to this trade was, wow, I'm stunned. But the Buccaneers already have O.J. Howard and Cameron Brate. Why are they trading for Gronk? I understand that when you make the investment in Brady, you have to go all in. And Rob Gronkowski is better than O.J. Howard, and he's better than Cameron Brate. But it just surprised me that the Buccaneers were foregoing players that they already had under contract, younger players, solid players, for Gronkowski. I'm not saying it's the wrong decision. It's the right decision. I would have done this trade 100 times out of 100 if I was Jason Licht. It was just surprising to me. Make no mistake about it. This means that O.J. Howard is going to be traded. Brate will probably stay as a blocking tight end. Maybe Howard can come to the Patriots in a separate deal. That's happened before. I'm not sure exactly what other teams need a tight end, but you could do a lot worse than O.J. Howard. He's better than Cole Kmet. He's better than Albert Okwukpenam. He's better than Jared Pinkney. You can make the argument that if you're looking at one of those guys in the draft, you should just trade for O.J. Howard. In fact, Jenna Lane of ESPN.com said that the Buccaneers nearly traded Howard to the Redskins for Trent Williams. Now, we don't know whether draft picks were part of that, if that was a one-for-one swap, but I'll tell you, it makes sense. The Buccaneers get a really good offensive tackle to help protect Brady, another guy who sat out a year, but you have to take the gamble. Make no mistake about it, it's a gamble to trade for a guy who sat out a year. The list of those players to come back and look great right away is very, very small. You've got Peyton Manning, Tom Brady, and that's it. I wouldn't even put Andrew Luck on that list. Luck, when he came back, wasn't great. He was really, really, really good. I wouldn't say he was great. And even then, Manning and Brady sat out years because of injury. You want to tell me that Brady technically didn't sit out 08? He played in a little bit of the first game of the season? Okay, fine. But the sentiment still remains the same. You understand the point I'm making. It would make sense for the Redskins to give Haskins a good young weapon, pair him with Terry McLaurin. Their tight end last year was Jeremy Sprinkle. All due respect to Sprinkle, no one's going to be mistaking him for Shannon Sharp anytime soon. I wouldn't even say he's a particularly good player. He's just I don't want to write him off immediately because he's still young. He can still turn his career around, but it's not looking good for him, I can tell you that. The Redskins may be amenable to that type of a trade. Obviously, there would have to be some kind of a pick swap happening. I'm not sure exactly what it would be. There's no way the Redskins would do that, trade one for one. They've been holding out for a second for Trent Williams. Look, I like O.J. Howard. He still has some potential, but he's not a second-round talent. He's a third. O.J. Howard, a third and a fourth for Trent Williams. It seems kind of steep. The Redskins would have to send something back along with Williams. But that may be the start of something. Like I said earlier, maybe the Patriots could consider trading for Howard. Belichick loves his tight ends. He could do a lot worse than O.J. Howard. I saw something on Twitter that this is basically found money for the Patriots. Gronkowski wasn't gonna play for him, so they got a 4th round pick basically for nothing. Look, I understand the point that person made, but it's not for nothing. You still have to see Gronkowski play in another uniform. Now, you're right that it's not going to affect you. The Buccaneers don't play the Patriots next year. I don't know if they do the year after, but I'll tell you, I'm going to be watching that game if they do. You know, he's still putting up numbers for another team. Does it affect you directly? No. And that's the Patriots way. You trade these guys to teams that you're never going to see. Or you just don't care about in the case of Demaryius Thomas. But the simple fact is you still could have had this guy, or at the very least kept him from playing in the NFL, and you didn't. You lost this trade. If the point is that the Patriots won this trade because they got free money, they got a free draft pick, no, that's wrong. You got a low 4th round pick for the best tight end of this era. Is he going to be that for the Buccaneers next year? No. But he's still worth more than a low 4th. I'd have pushed for 117 if I was Belichick. You've got to have some kind of pride. You want to tell me you wanted to do right by Gronkowski and Brady? Let them play together in Tampa for 2 more years? Alright, fine. That's a nice thing for Belichick to do, but that's not his MO. Now, all of a sudden, he's gonna kowtow to Brady? When did he start doing that? If he wanted to do that, he would have done it about 2 years ago. To entice Brady to stay. No. I don't think this was done to placate Brady and Gronk. I mean, here's the biggest knock towards that notion. There's nothing that Bill Belichick cares more about than winning. He will do whatever it takes to win. He's now going to watch the Buccaneers, a team that he lost Tom Brady and Rob Gronkowski to, finish with a better record than him. That's going to eat at him. And there are going to be a lot of teams that finish with better records than the Patriots. The Patriots and Jets, I think, are going to be fighting it out for that last place spot in the division. I'm not sure exactly what the Patriots win-loss record is going to be. I haven't looked at their schedule. I know I said before that the Jets are going to go 5-11. It's possible that the Patriots could finish with a worse record than that. I don't see them as a 6-win team. I mean, on paper, who has the better roster right now, Jets or Patriots? The answer is the Jets. All the Patriots have going for them is the coach. And I've said this a billion times. Talent wins over scheme in the NFL. Can Belichick push these players to do more than they usually would do under another coach? No question. He's done it 1,000 times. But that only accounts for so much. You want to tell me that you think Jarrett Stidham can turn into a good quarterback, that the Patriots are high on him, and he's going to turn into a really good player in this league? You can make that argument, but it's not a guarantee. That's the thing. All in all, fantastic trade for the Buccaneers. There's no possible way you can begrudge this for him. A great situation for Gronk. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say I wish him nothing but the best in Tampa Bay. I want him to succeed. He's a very likable guy. It seems like he knows what he needs, and he knows how to get it. He may be smarter than all of us. Who knows? As for the Patriots, I can't necessarily begrudge the trade. You're getting a late 4th round pick for a guy who was just going to sit on your reserve list all year. So is it found money from that perspective? Yeah, but the simple fact is he could have been playing for you, and he's not. That's the bottom line. There was another story that popped up as I was recording yesterday's show, but I knew that there wasn't going to be a lot to talk about today. There was a lot to talk about yesterday, so I wanted to save that story for today. It's a story that has been going on for a long time. I haven't talked about it. And it is that minor league baseball may be closer than it ever has been before to being contracted. Now, granted, they issued a statement in the afternoon saying that's not true, we're still negotiating, blah, 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 but there's clearly smoke there. It's no secret that they're talking. The specifics of the report, and this was by J.J. Cooper of Baseball America, are that all big league teams will end up with 4 affiliated minor league teams. So that's probably going to be AAA, AA, Single A, and short season. One other thing that was alluded to in that article is that Major League Baseball may look to set up other leagues, like the Atlantic League, where they can try out new rules and stuff like that. Maybe have some kind of a showcase for players trying to get back into baseball. But let me just focus on the contraction of minor league baseball. There are too many teams. I don't think that's a crazy thing to say. You look at a team like the Yankees, and I haven't done this for every team, but I just looked at my favorite team. Do you know how many minor league affiliates the Yankees have? They have 9. AAA, AA, Single A Advanced, regular Single A, Short Season A, Rookie Advanced, and they have 3 rookie teams. They have 2 teams in the Gulf Coast League and 1 in the Dominican Summer League. No team needs 9 minor league affiliates. There's literally no good reason to have 9 minor league teams. And bear in mind, all those teams are costing the Yankees a lot of money. Now, can they afford it? Yes, they're the Yankees. But for teams that don't have a lot of money, if they only have 7 or 6 or 5 minor league teams, that's still a significant drain on your payroll that you don't need. Bear in mind, you have to pay the executives, the manager, the coaches, the players, and a whole host of other people. There's no way that they make money. Some may. If they're playing in a city where there's nothing else to do in the summer, and they give away cheap seats, maybe they make it up on the back end, and maybe they break even, or maybe make a little bit of money, but I'd venture to guess that a lot of those teams don't make money. The minor leagues should be contracted. Yes. There isn't enough talent to support 9 minor league affiliates per team, or 8 or 7 or 6 or 5. 4 is very fair. And I love the fact that they're keeping the short season teams around, because traditionally that's where the recently signed draft picks go. They don't go to Single A or Double A usually. They go to short season ball, where they can really hone their craft. Does it stink that we're going to lose jobs because of this? No question. And I hope that each team provides some sort of a safety net for all those people that are losing jobs. There are going to be a lot of people out of work. Maybe some of them will latch on in new roles, but a lot of them won't. That's unfortunate, but it's the nature of the beast. Never lose sight of the fact that sports is a business. Everything is done to make money. Why do teams sign big free agents or trade for superstars? They want to win. Why do they want to win? To get that sweet, sweet playoff revenue. Is there some appeal to winning that last game of the season? No question. That's what the executives and the coaches and the managers and the players want. But the owners, they don't care. They want to make money. The majority of owners would forego a winning season for a profitable one. Winning doesn't guarantee that you're going to turn a profit. If you have a lot of money invested in payroll, getting that playoff revenue and drawing that extra money from concessions, that doesn't make up for it wholly. Now, sometimes it does. If you're a team like the Yankees, I promise you, if we had played a full season, they'd have made money. But not every team is the Yankees. Not every team has that fan base. Not every team is fortunate enough to have fans that have that type of disposable income to spend that much on tickets, food, and souvenirs. That's why you see the dollar hot dog nights and the cheap tickets and stuff like that. Those teams need to get butts in the seats. And when you look at a minor league team, if they're only getting 5,000 people per game, they're losing money. There are a lot of owners that don't care about player development. It's the GMs that care about that. It's the scouts that care about that. They'll put money into the major league team, but the rookie league teams? How does that help me win now? You want to tell me that some of these teams have independent owners? They do. But even then, those independent owners are still losing money. That's the thing. There are very few owners that are willing to take a hit just to live their dream of owning a sports team. They can make it up with other business interests. No. You buy a sports team to make money. George Steinbrenner bought the Yankees for $10 million in 1973. The Yankees right now are one of the most valuable sports teams in the world. George had that vision, and he executed it. And he put money into the team to build the brand and drive that value up. But not every team has that owner that's willing to do that. There are a lot of owners that are willing to just sit back and not do what it takes to build a winner. Winning does drive up value. But there are a lot of owners that aren't patient enough to see that through. It's going to be sad to see these teams go. There's no question. And it's going to hurt the cities that those teams play in. If they don't have any other sports teams, yeah, it's going to stink. And a lot of people are going to lose jobs. That's what's unfortunate. Unfortunately, though, it's the nature of the beast. We have too many minor league teams anyway. Contraction is necessary. Realignment is necessary. I can't say I begrudge the decision. In fact, I support it. Alright, so before I recorded yesterday's show, Michael Lombardi of The Ringer sent out another tweet listing players that are on the trade block. Now, I didn't include that because I already had a Lombardi story. I didn't want to. So, I'll go over it now. This isn't all San Francisco 49ers. In fact, none of these guys are 49ers. They are Rasul Douglas of the Eagles, P.J. Hall of the Raiders, Malik Hooker of the Colts, and Adam Shaheen of the Bears. Douglas had a bad year last year, but that was really the first bad year he had. There was a time in my life when I wanted to go to WVU, so I have followed his career. He's never been great, but he's always been solid. 2 years ago, he had a 69.6 overall grade, according to Pro Football Focus. Last year, he had a 52 overall grade. Yeah, Howie Roseman's going to take notice of that, and he's going to look to trade you and replace you with a younger option. I'd want to push for a fourth if I was Roseman. Douglas still has potential. I wouldn't give him away. P.J. Hall makes no sense to trade. He's a really good defensive lineman. One of the more underrated ones in the league. He's more of a rotational guy. He's never played more than 600 snaps in a season. But I think if he was a full-time starting defensive lineman, he'd be really, really good. His rookie year in 2018, he had a 65.6 overall grade. Last year, it went up to 70.1. I don't know what more you want from him, if you're Gruden. He's getting better. Stick with him. Quite honestly, I'd push for a third if I was Gruden. And even then, Hall was picked in the second round. And this is only his third year coming up. You're losing that trade. No team is going to give up a second. A third, maybe if you're desperate for a defensive lineman and you think Hall has a ton of talent like me. I don't see Hall going anywhere. At least I hope he doesn't for the Raiders' sake. I think he can be a very good foundational piece for him. Malik Hooker was the guy on this list that really caught me by surprise. This guy was the 15th overall pick in 2017, very highly thought of coming out of OSU, and I've been following his career, and he's always been really good. He's never had a Pro Football Focus grade worse than 65, and that was his rookie season. The year after that, 79.2. The year after that, 69.5. Yeah, he missed 3 games last year. Okay, that happens. That's why you have backups. He's still one of the better safeties in the league. And definitely one of the most underrated ones. I wouldn't trade him for anything. Hell, I'd push for a second if I was Chris Ballard. No team is going to give me that, so I'll hold on to him. Yeah, I don't mind that at all. Look, there is logic to testing the waters for some players and seeing what they're worth. Maybe a team bowls you over. If a team offers 2 first-round picks for Malik Hooker, yeah, you would do that. But no one's going to do that. You have to be realistic. Why would you put these guys out there? It makes no sense. It's pretty clear that the Bears need tight end help. Obviously, they cut Trey Burton, and now they're looking to trade Adam Shaheen. I remember liking him out of Ashland. I thought he made sense for the Jets because they needed a tight end. Boy, oh boy, am I glad they passed on him. Shaheen has been a big disappointment since coming into the NFL. He was a second-round pick. I remember thinking that was crazy at the time. In his career, he's only had 26 catches for 249 yards and 4 touchdowns. As a second-round pick, he should have that in half a season. The Bears would be lucky to get a 7th-round pick for him. They're the team that I think is most likely to trade for O.J. Howard. I could see them trading one of their seconds for Howard and really giving Trubisky or Foles a reliable tight end. Keep this in mind, the Bears have 2 seconds, and then they don't pick again until the 5th round. They're still recovering from the Khalil Mack trade that's still up in the air. We don't know who's going to win that trade. The Raiders need to hit on those picks, and Mack needs to win a Super Bowl for that to work. If you pair O.J. Howard with Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller, that's a solid group. It's not great, but Trubisky and Foles should be able to have a good season with him. Alright, here's my interview with Tom Van Riper. It went really long, but I had a great time doing it. I love Hall of Faming. Had a lot of fun talking to him, even though I disagreed with him on the majority of the guys that he mentioned. Here it is. Hope you enjoy it. You're listening to the Jacob Valk Show. I am Jacob Valk, and I'm fortunate enough to be talking to a friend of mine, a very highly distinguished author. It is Tom Van Riper. His latest book is New York Loves Them, Cooperstown Snubs Them, Great Mets and Yankees Who Belong in the Hall of Fame. Tom, long time no chat. How are you today, pal? Okay?
Yeah, doing okay, as well as can be expected, right?
Yeah, we're getting through this. We keep on keeping on as human beings, so...
That's right.
We're powering through this. We'll go through the book's chapters in order. What can you tell us about the Hall of Fame candidacy of Ron Guidry?
Ron Guidry never got, well, like most guys in this book, and I wanted to keep this kind of a New York-centric book because I think there are a lot of players out there you could debate ought to be in the Hall of Fame or not be in the Hall of Fame. It could be a very big subject, but to kind of boil it down to the ground, I thought, let's do something for New York baseball fans the way I grew up and so many others did, and I thought, let's have kind of a focus on New York and former Mets and Yankees that are big fan favorites of from yesteryear of a lot of people. So starting off with Ron Guidry, he never got much support. He got under 10%. He spent a couple of years or so on the ballot, just barely got over that 5% threshold. Never got, I don't think, as much as 10%, and after a few years or so, he was off the ballot. And I think the reason Ron Guidry is not in the Hall of Fame and the reason he was viewed as, a nice pitcher but not a Hall of Famer was he peaked a little bit late in his career. He struggled in the minors when he was a young pitcher. He didn't really hit his stride as a big leaguer till he was about 26, and he had a great run for a decade. He had a couple of in particular, one really, really big year in 1978, in which he had one of the great seasons of all time when he went 25-3 with 1.74 ERA and 9 shutouts. But overall, he's seen as a guy who just didn't have the career heft. He didn't have the 300 wins. In fact, he had a little bit under 200 wins in his career. So you don't think of him, at least most people didn't for a long time, as a Hall of Fame pitcher. But it's interesting to me because when you look at the advanced stats that are available now, that were not available at the time that these guys were playing, or even for a good number of years after they retired, I think it's worthwhile to go back and give some of these guys a second look with the things we know today. You look at the stats like ERA plus. What was his ERA relative to the league average during his time? How about WHIP, right? WHIP, walks and hits allowed per inning. WAR, wins above replacement, which is basically a conundrum of all these different stats: strikeout rate and walk rate and hits allowed rate and so forth. Relative to what the league norm was during his time. And when you look at it that way and add it up, Ron Guidry had 7 years really where he was a premier pitcher in the major leagues. He had a few others that were not all-star but very good, very solid that he tacked on top of those great years that he had. And when you add it all up, he's not an upper-tier Hall of Famer. He's not an obvious Hall of Famer. He doesn't have the numbers of Tom Seaver, doesn't have the numbers of Steve Carlton or some other great pitchers that you could name, but he does have numbers that are on par with plenty of pitchers who are in the Hall of Fame who are kind of in that tier below that.
Now, here's what I'll come back at you with Guidry, and I agree with you that his peak in the mid-'70s to the mid-'80s, he had some good Hall of Fame years there, obviously 78, 79, 85, 83. I'm looking at his stats right now. Mm-hmm. He has Hall of Fame years there. Here's what I'm going to come back at you with. 170 wins, 1,778 strikeouts. That doesn't scream Hall of Fame to me. What's your response to that?
Yeah, it doesn't. See, to me, lifetime totals are only part of the story. Okay. There are two things. He doesn't have that heft, as I would call it, right? That the large number of compiling a lot of career wins and a lot of career strikeouts. But I think if you look at the Hall of Fame driven as much by all-star seasons, Hall of Fame Hall of Fame type seasons, Ron Guidry basically is about equal to Whitey Ford in Yankee lore in terms of how well he pitched. Whitey Ford pitched for the Yankees.
Ford was the ace of a bunch of World Series winning teams, though.
Well, that's right, and Ford pitched on those great teams. Ford was a terrific pitcher and probably belongs in the Hall of Fame.
No question.
And Whitey Ford pitched for the New York Yankees in the 1950s and early 60s when they were in the World Series almost every year. He was a really, really nice pitcher, really pitching on good teams. And he was leading them. He was one of the leading men in terms of names, right up there with Mickey Mantle and Yogi Berra of that whole Yankee dynasty period. You look at Whitey Ford's wins above replacement for his career, it's about a 53. Ron Guidry is a 48, right? They're very close. And Guidry, his 5 or 6 best years were better than Ford's 5 or 6 best years, if you really kind of break down the career.
It's close. It's close. I'll give you that it's close. 78 measures up well with 61, and 85 measures up really well with 63. So that's
here's the thing: you're talking about when you talk about the top guys, you're talking about the win total, right, and the win-loss record. I kind of tend to downplay that for the most part because wins for pitchers are a derivative stat, right? They're not really a pitcher has a terrific win-loss record. It's really more of an indicator that he did well, but not so much a performance measurement in and of itself. I know Whitey Ford had, what was it, a 25-4 record maybe? Is that what he was?
25-4 and 61, yeah.
In 1961. The 1961 Yankees were one of the great teams of all time. It's still a great record. And right. He had a great year anyway, regardless of what his record was. Had he pitched for a different team, his record wouldn't have been anywhere near that good. But he still would have been the same pitcher. I don't put a lot of emphasis on wins and losses because they're not really a performance measurement for a pitcher, right? A pitcher goes 7 innings, gives up 2 runs. Let's say that's a good outing, right? He might wind up with a win or a loss or a no decision based on how much run support he got from his team. Now, anyone who pitches that well consistently, right, say 7 innings, 2 runs, is bound to win more often than he's going to lose.
Unless your name is Jacob deGrom.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, there's a good example of someone who is kind of representative that maybe the people who vote for the awards these days are coming around and they're thinking a little bit. I mean, a generation ago, or even 10 years or so ago, it would not have been feasible for a pitcher going 10-9 to win a Cy Young.
Right.
But
or even 11-8.
That's right. I mean, DeGrom was 10-9 the first year, and then was it 11-8 the most recent year? Yeah. So he 10-9 and 11-8. It used to be unheard of that would win a Cy Young, but the voters seem to be finally at a point. We've kind of gotten to that point where voters are looking past the win-loss records and looking at the numbers that make up and indicate effective pitching, regardless of wins and losses. That wouldn't have happened back in the day. I'm old enough to remember 1987. Just a quick example: Nolan Ryan was pitching for the Houston Astros. He went 8-16 that season. He was number 1 in the league in ERA, number 1 in the league in strikeouts, and he had, I'm not sure how many innings, but well over 200 innings, and he was 8-16. And I remember the writers at the time saying, you saw the comments in the paper, well, they kind of chalked up that one-loss record as kind of a fluke, just a case of bad luck, because he happened to pitch for the second lowest scoring team in the league. And they were right. Everyone said, I think he didn't win the Cy Young that year, which You could have even argued that he should have, but that wasn't going to happen with a record of 8-16, at least not back then. But I think it just kind of shows that a one-loss record is often an indicator of how well a guy is pitching, but it's really not a measurement of performance in and of itself. It's just derivative of how well he pitches as well as what kind of support he gets.
So let's get off pitchers for a little bit.
Yeah.
Can you make the case for Greg Nettles to be a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, Greg Nettles. Now, when he was playing, I never thought of him as a Hall of Famer. Most people kind of think, yeah, nice player. People from my generation, right? Hall of Very Good. By the way, if you ask me, that's become a tiresome phrase because people say that all the time. Hall of the Very Good, and it usually means I don't really get the new stats. That's how I take it. But okay. Greg Nettles. Now, Greg Nettles had his big years with the Yankees when I was, from the time I was about 10 years old until, through my teen years, around that age. And at that time, I never thought of him as a superstar or a guy who was going to be in the Hall of Fame. He was one of those nice supplementary players. The Yankees revolved around Thurman Munson and Reggie Jackson, and most of the noise was made by Billy Martin and George Steinbrenner. And Nettles was the guy playing third base. He hit a good number of homers, terrific fielder, but he only hit about 250. Nice complementary piece, not really the top dog or close to the top dog on the team. When you look at his career more in hindsight, the advanced numbers say that, for instance, on Fangraphs, he saved 148 runs, I believe is the number, runs at third base. In other words, it's an estimate of the number of runs that he prevented relative to the average at his position during his time. For perspective, Brooks Robinson is about twice that many, and Brooks Robinson is, the greatest of all time. But aside from Brooks Robinson, there are only a couple in history who measure up to Greg Nettles. I mean, he truly was not only a terrific fielder that everybody thought he was at the time, but really even better than that if you look at the advanced numbers now. I mean, he had years where his defensive wins above replacement was over a 3, which is almost an unheard of number. In the same years that Brooks Robinson, who was getting older by then, was like a 2.5. Nettles, I think, won only 2 Gold Gloves in his career, but if you look back now with the advanced metrics we have for defense, he really should have won several more. And in terms of his hitting, the 1970s and 80s when he was playing was kind of a dead ball era. There was not a lot of power. 30-some-odd home runs led the league in most seasons. Nettles himself actually led the league one year with 32. And he hit, in that era, 390 career homers. Now, you hear that number and you think, it's a nice number, it's impressive, but it's not 500, right? It's not that Hall of Fame number that we think of.
Right.
But 390 in that era, I researched a lot of this nitty-gritty. Greg Nettles homered 40-some-odd% more often than a typical player during his time. That's kind of how it breaks down. That his home run rate, you look at his home run per at-bats in the 1970s and 80s and compare it to the average player during the same period, he homered about 44% more often than a typical player. Now, had he done that, had he put together that same ratio 20 years later, from the mid-90s into the 2000s when there was way more offense, he would have had 500 homers. So I think you have to take a player's stats and put them in the context of the era in which they were derived. I think that makes a lot more sense than just a raw total. Because one last thing on the home runs, Greg Nettles on the all-time home run list is, I think, number 63. Now, the 62 guys ahead of him, there's only a few whose careers strongly overlapped with Greg Nettles. I mean, in that era, you had Mike Schmidt and you had Dave Kingman. People will know some of these names. Darrell Evans.
Jim Rice.
Jim Rice did not hit. Had a few home runs fewer than Nettles.
Rice had a few less. Okay, 390 to.
He did, Nettles was actually up and playing for 5 or 6 years before Jim Rice. But they largely overlap. But you're right. Rice is kind of right there as well. But it's only a handful of players from his time who were ahead of him on the list. Everyone else is from, a more heavy-hitting era. So what that means is, regardless of his raw total, he was among the top handful of home run hitters of his time, and he's among the top handful of defensive third basemen in history. You add all that up, his career wins above replacement is a 68. Okay, Derek Jeter, for instance, is a 72. Not that different, and yet we don't have Greg Nettles isn't really thought of quite that highly. He was thought of as a nice player, as you said, Hall of Very Good, but not Hall of Fame. But yet, when you kind of put all his stats in perspective of the era, even though he wasn't a great hitter for average, he did walk a lot. His on-base numbers are actually slightly above average. So he's kind of neutral in the on-base territory. When you add that up with his level of power and his level of defense, it adds up to a Hall of Fame player, if you ask me.
Well, here's what I'll come back at you with. And I'm going to start with a tough question that I don't know the answer to. If you know the answer to it, God bless you. When Greg Nettles retired, where was he on the home run leaderboard? Because that's the best way to measure how great of a power hitter he was.
That's a good question. I don't know exactly.
Okay.
There are certainly a number of players since Greg Nettles' day who have passed him. I mean, offhand, I don't know how many it is.
Oh, no question.
It might be 15. It might be 15. It might be 20.
No question.
But although I'll respectfully disagree with your premise, I never really thought it was much of an indicator of where a guy was when he retired. I mean, I think you have to put it into the context of everything.
See, now I like total body of work. I like that for Hall of Fame. I don't like.
I like total body of work, but I look at where a guy is. And one guy, made an interesting point to me. He said, baseball writer Rob Nair, I interviewed him for the book, and he said, I think Greg Nettles has a good case. The only thing is, the reason is he's kind of fading a little bit is because his case would have been even better about 20 years ago before some more recent third baseman came along and surpassed him.
So that's a fair point.
Yeah, he's talking about Wade Boggs, Chipper Jones,
Beltre.
More recently, you could say Scott Rowland, I think, who's probably going to get in pretty soon.
I don't think he should, but you're right that he will. No, I don't think Rowland's a Hall of Famer. I watched Rowland play. I didn't think of him as a Hall of Famer. Hall of Very Good, not Hall of Fame.
Yeah, people are debating on Rowland. He got a lot of votes allowed. He's only been on the ballot a couple of years, and
he'll get in.
It looks like he'll get in. I know. I saw Rowland play here and there, and I didn't. You're right. I didn't think of him quite in that realm as well. Although his defensive numbers are tremendous, so he might. I think that's what's driving people toward him.
I don't look at fielding as, and my father and I have had this argument a million times. He thinks Bill Mazeroski should be in the Hall of Fame. I don't. He looks at fielding a lot more than I do for the Hall of Fame. I look at it as just a nice complementary piece to your Hall of Fame argument. I don't think it should be the be-all, end-all. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I probably stand right in between you and your father.
Okay.
I would have to say. I think fielding, especially when you can quantify, let's say when Fangraphs talks about how many runs a guy is worth in the field, and I don't think the numbers that Fangraphs has or other sites can be absolutely accurate. It's almost impossible to do that. But the data is so sophisticated where you can look at how many balls a guy gets to in his area of the field that another guy wouldn't. It's the kind of thing that people used to talk about casually. He's got great range and that, but it wasn't really quantified. So some of these more advanced metrics we have now from Fangraphs and from Baseball Reference make an attempt to actually quantify that stuff. And I don't think it can possibly be absolutely accurate. But I do feel like the logic is sound enough that it's probably a good indicator as to how valuable a guy is in the field. See, I agree with you on Bill Mazeroski because Bill Mazeroski was not much of an offensive player. I personally would not have him in the Hall of Fame either because his overall value, which is driven by defense, is just not quite the Hall of Fame. But Greg Nettles, who's something of a Mazeroski, a version of Mazeroski playing third base, with his defense, but also being a big home run hitter of his time, and offering more offensive value, I think added together, that's enough for him. So I think Nettles has more of the combination than Mazeroski does.
Just one final point on Nettles, and then we'll move on. If Greg Nettles were to be elected to the Hall of Fame, he would have the lowest batting average out of any Hall of Fame hitter. What's your response to that?
Is that right?
Yeah. His career average was
248.
248. The lowest is Ray Schalk with 253, Harmon Killebrew at 256, Rabbit Moranville 258, and then you've got a bunch of old pitchers. What's your response to that?
First, I'm surprised. I'm a little that's an interesting tidbit that I didn't know. But secondly, I don't think it matters that much because batting average doesn't matter that much. I don't think.
It mattered back when he played. No one cared about on-base percentage when he played.
Yeah, but I still think you measure the guy by today's standards, not so much. In other words, we look back and we think, well, great. That's the reason, by the way, he's not in the Hall of Fame. Or at least one of the big reasons. You look, he's only like a 245, 250 hitter, not a Hall of Famer. Everyone was obsessed back then with a 300 average. Now we look back and say, you know what? All those walks he got, where 248 batting average turned into, I think, a 336 on base percentage. That's a lot better. His on-base percentage was actually, to be specific, 1.5% higher than the average on-base percentage during his career.
Do you think that 1.5% better than the average, though, should get you in the Hall of Fame?
But I think he's a Hall of Famer because of his absolutely historic elite defense and because he was one of the top home run hitters of his time. The on-base numbers are basically neutral. So he's right above, kind of almost right at the average in terms of on-base. So I think you have a neutral on-base number that kind of doesn't particularly add to nor subtract from his Hall of Fame qualities, which are his defense and his power. So basically he was an absolute star power-wise. He was an absolute star defensively, and he was neutral when it came to getting on base. I think it still adds up to Hall of Fame.
Talking to Tom Van Riper, the author of New York Loves Them, Cooperstown Snubs Them, great Mets and Yankees who belong in the Hall of Fame. So would you be able to describe the argument for putting Willie Randolph in the Hall of Fame?
Well, you might not like it because it is based largely on defense.
A guy who won no Gold Gloves, you're going to put him in based on defense?
His defensive numbers are great. Willie Randolph, Gold Gloves, first of all, don't mean anything. All it is a voted award.
Oh, come on. That's a pretty good award. Phil Mazeroski's in because of his Gold Gloves. He had 11. We're putting Trammell in because of his Gold Gloves?
Yeah, but if you look at a guy, we can see from the stats how good a guy was defensively. Whether or not he was voted a Gold Glove in a given year, does it really matter? It's just a voted award. It's just an opinion of 24 writers or something in a given year.
He should have at least one, though, don't you think? I mean, I'm not saying Randolph was a bad fielder. Willie Randolph was a very good, bordering on great fielding second baseman. Was he playing behind some really good fielding second basemen, guys like Bobby Grich and Damaso Garcia had a decent glove? Yeah, I'll give you that. But he should have one if you're going to put him in on defense. What's your response?
Well, he probably should have. If the correct guy won every year, then he would. In fact, I think I had one year in particular. Maybe his rookie year with the Yankees, or maybe the next year. I think it was '76.
Yeah, that was his first year with the Yankees.
He came up with the Pirates the year before, but his first real full year was with the Yankees in '76, and then let's see, I think his defensive runs saved, if you look it up now, was about 19, and Bobby Grich was 1.
Ooh.
19 versus 1. And the defensive WAR, I don't remember offhand, but Randolph's was way higher. And Bobby Grich got the Gold Glove because who got the Gold Glove? The guy who was more established, right? The guy who was...
That's a fair point.
Now, of course, you could argue that Randolph, maybe by the time he was established better, a few years later, maybe could have won some, and I'm not sure why he didn't. I do know that his fielding numbers are really excellent, and just anecdotally, if you look at some of the things he did on the field, hanging tough during double plays, waving off veteran outfielders even when he was a very young player, he was in control out there. He was in charge of that middle of the field at Yankee Stadium, even from when he was 21, 22 years old. Did you ever see the play? Let me ask you real quick. Did you ever see the play 1977? Have you ever seen this on tape when the famous Yankees-Royals fifth and deciding game of the American League Championship Series, George Brett hits a triple up the gap to right center, and he slides hard into Greg Nettles at third base, and after the hard slide, they push each other, and a big fight erupts?
Truthfully, I have not seen that clip. I'll be honest.
Oh, okay.
But you can walk me through it if you want.
Yeah, all I was going to say was I kind of went through it a little bit in the Willie Randolph chapter because the most interesting or the best baseball play of the whole sequence came from Randolph, which kind of got forgotten, which is almost like the story of his career, because in the bottom of the first inning, it's the fifth and deciding game. Royals have a man on base. Brett hits a triple to right center field, goes off the wall. The relay comes in. Willie Randolph gets the relay throw in short right center field and turns and just serves this absolute P on the fly to Nettles at third base, and they miss getting Brett out by like a centimeter. It was just a tremendous relay throw. And it's the kind of thing that Willie Randolph did all the time, but nobody really remembered it because a second later, I mean, Brett was safe by about an inch, and a second later, Brett and Nettles get up and start pushing each other, and then the bench is clear, and so all the attention turns to the fight.
Right.
Randolph's play, turned out to be inconsequential because everyone started paying attention to the fight, and because Brett was safe anyway, despite Randolph's great throw. But I remember looking at that clip and thinking, wow, that throw Willie Randolph made on that relay was just a thing of beauty to watch, and that was just a thing he did all the time.
Yeah, and look, there's no question that Willie Randolph was an extremely underrated piece of some great Yankees teams, 77, 78, and some lesser teams that were still good, teams like 76, 81, very underrated player. I'm with you there, Hall of Fame. I don't go that far, but years.
Okay, yeah. I mean, in that era, I mean, it's almost like two different eras because Randolph was a younger player on those Reggie Jackson, Thurman Munson, Greg
and
Nettles.
He held his own on those teams.
Yeah, he was one of the top players on those teams. And when the Yankees had those teams in the mid '80s with Mattingly and Winfield and Rickey Henderson, Randolph was still one of the better players on those teams. I mean, he was he was the rock all the way through that period. Here's a quick thing: the 13 years that he was the Yankee regular second baseman, 1976 through 1988, his WAR was a 54, which was the highest of any second baseman in the major leagues over that stretch. So he was the game's best second baseman in all likelihood for that 13-year stretch of 1976 to 88. He was driven by his defense and by his on-base acumen. He was one of the better on-base guys. He didn't have power. His weakness was, he had 50-some-odd home runs for his whole career. He didn't hit home runs, and there's no way you can get around that. But his on-base, his speed, and his defense gave him, a career WAR of, I believe, in the mid-60s, and it was 54 during his Yankee career, and there was no second baseman in baseball that did better. The thing is, he got sandwiched a little bit. Joe Morgan was at his peak just as Randolph was coming up, and then by the time Randolph was getting into his 9th or 10th year, Ryan Sandberg came along. Those guys, in addition to the other stuff they could do, had much better power numbers. They got a lot of attention because they were good power hitters for middle infielders. But for the whole kind of mid-70s to mid-80s, even late 80s stretch, there really was not a better second baseman in the major leagues than Willie Randolph.
Now, here's another guy who was extremely underrated and spanned two Yankee eras, the Mattingly era to the Jeter era. And this is the first one that we sort of agree on. I'm borderline on this. You can certainly make the argument for him, and I'd listen. I understand the argument against it, but I'm certainly biased because I saw him play a lot. What can you tell us about the Hall of Fame candidacy of Bernie Williams?
Bernie Williams on those 1996 to 2000 Yankee championship teams when they won 4 out of 5 years was most definitely the best player on those teams. He was right there with Jeter. They were very close in terms of production on the field. Despite the fact that Jeter was always kind of got a little bit more attention, Bernie Williams was in some of those years just a one-man wrecking crew for that team offensively. I know Bernie Williams is not a slam dunk case because his career, he kind of petered out at about age 34. He had those 9 years really that he was great, and then he kind of fell off very suddenly. So he didn't accumulate a ton of lifetime homers and a ton of lifetime hits. I think he had 2,300 hits or something and not even quite 300 home runs. But for that period, starting basically around the 94 strike and through 95 and then right on up through about 2002 really, and then he fell off a little in 03, was just a premium offensive player, OPS plus around 140 or so year after year, won a batting title in 1998, cleanup hitter, middle of the order guy, switch hitter for 4 World Championship teams, and actually for 6 World Series teams total, 4 of which won the World Series. He was just a stud player with a great peak. He didn't tack on those. What people, I understand, ideally would like to see those 2 or 3 more years where he's good and maybe adds to his career totals a little bit. But if you look at what a premium player he was from age 26 to 34, to me, it's enough when you compare it to other Hall of Fame outfielders who statistically were no better. I mean, he compares favorably to Jim Rice. He compares favorably to Kirby Puckett. He compares favorably to some old-time center fielders, big names from baseball history, Earl Averill, Earl Combs, who was a great Yankee center fielder in the 20s and 30s in the Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig era.
I was about to say, another guy who got overshadowed by stars.
Yeah, although Earl Combs is in the Hall of Fame. I mean, I don't think he made it initially. He was voted in a little bit later by the Veterans Committee, but he did eventually make it. And I believe if some of those old-time center fielders, Earl Averill, Earl Combs, and some more relatively contemporary players like Jim Rice and Kirby Puckett are in the Hall of Fame, I think Bernie Williams should also be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and here's the best argument to me for putting Bernie Williams into the Hall of Fame. In the modern era, he has 4 World Series. That's pretty darn good to me. What's your response to that?
Yeah, and he was mainly because he was a central part of it. I'm not really that big on measuring individual players by team championships. Okay. You know what I mean? Because I think he'd be the same player on another team, but I think that still has to be considered to some degree. I mean, I know what you mean, because he was on all those pennant-winning teams. He played in 6 World Series. He won 4 of them. And he wasn't just kind of along for the ride. I mean, part of it said he was fortunate enough to play with the New York Yankees, let's say, instead of someone else. But it's also true that he was a big central part of that.
No question. He wasn't a hanger-on. He was an integral part.
Yeah, he really was the center of gravity for those lineups for all those years. They had, right-handed hitters on those Yankee teams like Jeter, Chuck Knobloch. You had lefties like Tino Martinez, Paul O'Neill, David Justice for part of that time, Darryl Strawberry for part of that time. When you have a guy, a true switch hitter who produces from both sides, who's right in the middle of that lineup, balancing against the lefties and the righties, that's a big weapon. I mean, he was, to me, the real. I mean, Jeter as well, but Williams in that middle part of the order was really the center of gravity for all those Yankee lineups that just dominated the league for several years.
Were you the one guy who didn't put Jeter on his Hall of Fame ballot? I'm asking everyone.
I don't have. No, I wasn't. I don't have a Hall of Fame vote.
I know. I'm just messing with you.
I wish I did. But speaking of Jeter, he is a little overly deified. I mean,
he shouldn't be in unanimously. But if Rivera got in unanimously, Jeter should have to.
No one got in unanimously except for Rivera.
I don't think Rivera should have been unanimous in the first place.
No, I think, Jeter's he's 3,400 hits, plus 310 batting average, whatever, and all the rings. I mean, Jeter's an easy Hall of Fame call. He's a great player, and he was a great player, and he's definitely a deserving Hall of Famer. But I always thought he was a little bit overdone with he's deified a little bit. People tend to talk about him like he's a Mount Rushmore type of player, which he's really not. He's.
Is he on your Yankees Mount Rushmore?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because he's on mine.
Yeah, Yankee Mount Rushmore. Yeah, I don't know. Can it only be 4, like the real Mount Rushmore?
Yeah, it can only be 4.
All right, I got to go Ruth, Gehrig, and Mantle, and then it's close. I might, Jeter versus DiMaggio for that 4th one, pretty close.
It is close. I'm with you there. Let me take you across the RFK Bridge now to Queens, that other New York team. Can you make the case for Keith Hernandez to be a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, Keith Hernandez is the best defensive first baseman who ever played. And Keith Hernandez had a. He's up there. Keith Hernandez had, I think he was. I can't remember on base percentage. He was.
On base percentage, his career is 384.
380. That's the number. But in terms of how close he was to the league lead, he was something like a top 5 guy in on base percentage, like a whole bunch of times. And I remember 384 at a time when. The average, this is again mostly the dead ball era, the 1970s and 80s, the average was something probably like 330, The average batting average in that era was about 255. The average on base about 320 to 330. So he's way above that. I think Keith Hernandez has been a victim of perception bias for his position because he played first base and he didn't hit a ton of home runs. That's what people want from first baseman. Every first baseman in the Hall of Fame is a big bopper, right? From the days of Lou Gehrig and Jimmy Fox and Mel Ott on through Killebrew and McCovey and then on to Frank Thomas and Jeff Bagwell, right? All big power guys who were intimidating at the plate. Hernandez is a whole different type of player. He could drive in a lot of runs without hitting a ton of homers. There was one year with the Cardinals, he had 7 home runs and 94 RBI. He hit the ball up the gap, lots of extra base power. He got on base. He had a great eye. He hit 300, and he had just a tremendous glove. And in terms of whether he's the best first baseman of all time, if you believe the number, now he's always kind of had that reputation. And I know sometimes you have to wonder, is it real or is it hype a little bit? Because fielding is sometimes tough to quantify. We're constantly reminded that the guy who looks good maybe didn't have the greatest range, which is not as readily apparent to the naked eye.
Hey, by the advanced numbers, Derek Jeter was not a good fielder. I'll tell you, Derek Jeter was a great fielder.
By the advanced numbers, Jeter is not a good fielder. I know. Jeter is a perfect.
I don't look at the advanced numbers for Jeter.
Jeter is an interesting case because he's defensively, because by the eye test he was fine. He seemed like he made all the plays. The numbers say that his range was not that great, that he didn't get the balls that other shortstops got to. I'm not sure exactly how much.
Well, I'll tell you what. How many shortstops could make that flip throw that Jeter made to get Jeremy Giambi out?
Yeah, well, I know, probably not many. But that's another thing about Jeter is that grows his legend is that was one play. I mean, he got a lot of narrative from that, just for his career as an awesome player because of that one flip play. It was a terrific play, but it was only one play in his whole career. No,
that's a fair point. No, you're right. You're right.
Hernandez, by the eye test, people used to, when he was playing, before anyone heard of Fangraphs or anything like that, people used to call him the best defensive first baseman of all time then, by the plays that he made. I mean, other teams would call off bunts when he was on the field. He changed the defense, right, because of his ability to charge in. I saw him once field a bunt on the third base side of the mound, throw to third base to get the lead runner, and then they threw back across and got a double play out of it. He was incredible in the field. And the thing is, the eye test in the case of Hernandez is backed up by the numbers you see on Fangraphs. So pretty much in every aspect of it, for those who saw him play and then checking that against the numbers that you have now in hindsight, it all on both sides shows he was most definitely the best defensive first baseman ever.
You could certainly make that argument. He has more Gold Gloves than any first baseman. Now that I'm thinking about it, yeah, you could certainly make that argument. Here's what I'll come back at you with, though, and I'm with you on not evaluating him on the home runs. He wasn't a power hitter. Okay, fine. He was a great first baseman. Traditionally, do you want your first baseman hit for power? Yeah, but if he doesn't, it's not the end of the world. Only 2,182 hits. That doesn't scream Hall of Famer to me. What's your response to that?
Well, I think the 384 on base percentage over the time that he played is much more important. I'm not big on accumulating lifetime totals.
Okay.
In hits and home runs and so forth. It's more about how many big years did you have.
All right.
Like Ted Williams didn't even get 3,000 hits, but he walked so much.
And he had over 500 home runs, though.
Right. Yeah, but people say, Ted Williams is like the greatest hitter of all time, but he didn't get 3,000 hits. That's kind of a quirky thing about his career. Of course, he missed time in the military, and so he probably would have had 3,000 hits. But Ted Williams was having these 450 on base years because he was walking 120 times because he had such a great eye, in addition to all the hits he got. So he never accumulated as many hits as maybe someone of his pedigree you thought would. Hernandez, here's basically. Are you a fan of OPS plus as a metric? It's on base plus.
Yeah,
plus.
I know what it is. I like it for determining how dominant players were. When we look at it for like career totals for Hall of Fame, I'm not crazy about it.
Okay, well, here's an interesting little tidbit. Maybe you find it a little less interesting if you don't like this, but it's it's on base plus slugging, right? And then adjusting it for the guy's ballpark and for the time that he played, right? How good was he compared to the league average? Because let's say in the case of Hernandez, the league averages were not very high, in terms of offensive numbers. So Keith Hernandez has an on-base plus slugging percentage of OPS plus, I should say, the adjusted, of like 128. And like Eddie Murray was a 129. I mean, they're almost the same. Eddie Murray easily made it into the Hall of Fame. Why? Because he had 500 home runs and 3,000 hits. He went through two of the big numbers in hits and career homers. But Hernandez had almost the same OPS plus, and he was a much better defensive player than Eddie Murray. I still think Eddie Murray had the better career when you really add it all up, because he did tack on some at least fairly productive years when he was older to kind of add on to his lifetime totals of hits and home runs. But for about 10 years when they were in their primes together, from about 1977 to 86, 87, they were virtually identical. Career WAR is like 68 to 60 in Murray's favor, mainly because he did a little more in the last 3 years or so. But those two guys are very close, I think, Keith Hernandez. But yet, Eddie Murray did what voters love, surpassing those numbers that end in multiple zeros.
Right.
3,000 hits, 500 home runs. Those are both. It is pretty amazing, because those are both individually, considered to be great plateaus, and he's only one of a few players in history to do both. With 500 homers and 3,000 hits. So he was clearly going to be a Hall of Famer, and he should be a Hall of Famer. But I think when you break down the entire game, on base, defense, everything else, Hernandez's career was just about as good as Eddie Murray's. He just didn't have those last 2 or 3 decent years to close out his career, which would have tacked on a few more hits and a few more WAR points and everything else. But from 1977 to 86, they were identical.
All right, so let's go back to pitchers now. Would you be able to describe the argument for putting Jerry Koosman in the Hall of Fame?
Yeah, Jerry Koosman, very underrated. Just like a lot of guys in the book. He's a guy I never thought of as a Hall of Famer when he was playing, or even for a while afterwards. But again, I'm a big advanced stats guy, and I'm very big into WAR and everything else. Jerry Koosman had let's start with that, and I agree. I don't know. People have different feelings about wins above replacement.
Here's my big argument against wins above replacement, and this is just true. In Miguel Cabrera's Triple Crown year, Robinson Cano had a higher WAR than Miguel Cabrera. As someone who saw Robinson Cano play every game that year, he was not better than Miguel Cabrera. I just don't think WAR is a great stat. What's your response to that? I mean, that's true. I'm not lying.
I didn't know that. I knew that people used to argue about Mike Trout having a higher WAR, which made more sense because he's such a great defensive player and he has the speed. So I didn't even really realize that about Cano. I don't know, and offhand, I don't know his numbers that particular year. I'm sure they were great, but not Triple Crown, right? So
right.
That might be a good point. And Cano was never got, in most years at least, he didn't have tremendous defensive numbers, so I'm not sure. Although he probably had better defensive numbers than Cabrera.
Anyone's a better
Anyway, when it comes to WAR, I know some people really believe in it, and some people just kind of dismiss it. I generally believe in it, even though I might not be as married to it as some people, because I don't think it can be perfect. I do think the logic behind it is sound when you look at what goes into it, and I don't think that assessing a player, it all begins and ends with WAR, but I think it's a pretty good indicator when you look at the WAR and think, wow, look at his career WAR. I'm going to take a closer look at this guy,
That's fair.
And so then at that point, when you see what the WAR is, you kind of drill down and look at some of the other stuff. So Jerry Koosman, to me, I never thought of him as a Hall of Famer because he was he was a number 2 behind Tom Seaver with the Mets for much of his prime. He was even in some individual seasons in the 70s a number 3. The Mets had a pitcher named John Matlack, really good left-handed pitcher for a while in the basically early to mid 70s, who had a number of really good years with the Mets. So the Mets were strong in their pitching in that era. And Koosman, I always got a little bit lost in the shuffle. He's kind of 2A and 2B with Matlack. Seaver is the clear ace and the obvious Hall of Famer. But when you look at Koosman, first of all, he won 222 games. And even though I'm not that big on wins as a metric, that's still a lot. He's won.
That's not Hall of Fame. The Hall of Fame is 300 wins.
Well, only something like 15 pitchers have 300 wins, right?
It's a high barrier. There's no question. But there
are about 60 pitchers in the Hall of Fame, and only 15 or 16 of them actually have 300 wins.
Well,
so there are
certainly strikeouts play a role in that, and Koosman does fare favorably in strikeouts. I know that.
Yeah, Koosman is like 30th all time in strikeouts.
Here's my argument against Koosman, and then I'll let you finish, because when I looked at your book, I saw Jerry Koosman. Really? But then when I actually looked at his stats, no, I evaluated your book fairly. I want you to know that. I hope you think I've been fair. Have I been fair?
Oh, you've been more than fair. This is good. I don't expect you to agree with me on everything. This is good. This is good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. Here's my argument against Koosman. He was a compiler. Those last few years of his career, he really wasn't that good. He had to hang around a lot to get over 2,500 strikeouts. What's your response to that?
No, well, those last few years might have gotten the 2,500 strikeouts, but I don't put much stock in that. Jerry Koosman had basically at least 8 years you would consider all-star level. Is basically the reason I would have him in. He got a little bit overshadowed. You look at, again, he put his stats into perspective. Look at his strikeout rate. Look at his whip. Look at his ERA and the ERA plus, and how does it compare year by year to the average, in that year? So you're putting his stats into the context of the time that he pitched, and he was way up there in terms of how much better he was than an average pitcher in ERA and strikeouts per 9 innings, whip, okay, all that stuff, even putting his one-loss record aside. He's comparable to a number of pitchers in the Hall of Fame and better than some. He's about equal to Don Sutton, for example. I shouldn't say equal. I shouldn't say equal. He's a little below Don Sutton because Don Sutton pitched like forever, right? And won 300. Don Sutton kind of tacked on some more quality seasons, even more than Koosman did. But Don Sutton's a guy in the Hall of Fame, and I think deservedly because he had about 5 seasons that were truly great seasons, and then he tacked on so much more on top of that you can't say he's not one of the top 50 pitchers or so of all time. So he does, even though he was kind of a compiler for a lot of his career. Another contemporary of Koosman, Catfish Hunter. There's no way Catfish Hunter was as good a pitcher as Jerry Koosman. Let's look at the WAR just for a second because not because and I agree it doesn't all begin and end with WAR, but just as that first point of comparison, Jerry Koosman is a 58. Catfish Hunter is a 36. I mean, Catfish Hunter was a nice pitcher. His best year actually was with the Yankees in 1975, the first year he went there because he had 320 innings and had a WAR of over 8. But he had a number of 20-win seasons. They came bunched right in a row. That 1972 to 75 period when he was with those great Oakland clubs, plus his first year with the Yankees. That's
the argument for Hunter. He had a great peak.
Yeah, but he had a great peak only in terms of winning. He pitched for those great Oakland clubs in the early to mid 70s. Then later he was on those strong Yankee teams, those World Series teams of the mid to late 70s. So he had nice one-loss records. He had 4 20-win seasons. He was also very high profile at the time because pitching for the A's and then the Yankees over that period, he was in the playoffs and the World Series year after year. He was always pitching in front of national audiences. He was in the All-Star game because he always had good one-loss records. He was always a good pitcher. Every year the nation saw him year after year pitching in the All-Star game, pitching in the playoffs, pitching in the World Series. So it did a lot for his national profile. Jerry Koosman, meanwhile, in terms of ERA and whip and strikeouts and everything else, was always outdoing Catfish Hunter. But he only had 2 20-win seasons. I'm sorry. I think he had one. No, yes. Jerry Koosman had 2 20-win seasons, one for the Mets and one later for the Minnesota Twins later in his career.
Right.
And he never pitched on teams that won all that much, except for the 1969 Mets. And then much later, when he was 40 years old, he pitched for the 1983 White Sox, who won the American League West that year and lost in the playoffs. But those are the only 2 times Jerry Koosman ever pitched for a team with as many as 90 wins in his career. I think common sense says if he were pitching for teams like the early 70s Oakland A's and the late 70s New York Yankees, he probably would have had his 5 or 6 20-win seasons. We don't know for sure. There's no way to know that for sure. But I think common sense says he would have had his 5 or 6 or so 20-win seasons pitching for those kind of clubs instead of the 2 that he had. And,
no, I agree with that notion.
In terms of left-handers during his era, there was Steve Carlton. Who else was better than him? A couple of other guys were close. You could make cases for guys like Tommy John, Mickey Lolich, Frank Tanana, are the other big names of that era. Jerry Koosman was right there, at least as good and probably a little better than all of those guys, except for Steve Carlton. And when you're 30th on the all-time strikeout list, it all adds up to a guy who was a little under the radar because he wasn't in the playoffs that much, and he was number 2 behind Tom Seaver for a lot of his prime. But when you add it up, you know, he's right there with Guidry, and with the guys I was comparing Guidry to, like Whitey Ford and some of the other names. I mean, Jerry Koosman's right there when you look at all the stats.
Talking to Tom Van Riper, the author of New York Loves Them, Cooperstown Snubs Them, great Mets and Yankees who belong in the Hall of Fame. And this guy who you have next, I agree with wholeheartedly, 100%. You don't need to convince me, but you may need to convince the person on the other end of the speaker. What can you tell us about the Hall of Fame candidacy of David Cone?
David Cone, yeah, I kind of like to conclude with him as in terms of the main chapters because he was a great Met and a great Yankee, five plus years in both places.
The compromise candidate.
That's right. In the picture, I have him in a Met uniform. You know, I hope the Yankee fans don't mind because it is a little Yankee movie. I've got 4 Yankees, 2 Mets, and then one guy who was on both. So I got to even it out a little bit. I put him in a Mets uniform. But David Cone, look, again, I'm going to start with WAR. Over 60, okay? He's right there. He's number 25 on the all-time strikeout list. And he was, again, I like to take the strikeouts, right? The strikeouts, the strikeout rate, the ERA plus, the whip, and all that stuff, and look at how much better he was than an average pitcher during the course of his career. And when you add it all up, David Cone is in that top. Let's see, there are 62 or 63 pitchers in the Hall of Fame. David Cone is probably in the top half of that. Okay, he had 8 or 9 seasons where his WAR was a 4 or higher, which is generally considered all-star level. He had one stretch, and this is in between his Met and Yankee days. He had a couple of monster years with the Royals when he was a free agent, signed with the Royals for a couple of years before he started bouncing around a little bit, back to Toronto and then ultimately to the Yankees. He had 3 years in a row where his WAR was about a 7. I mean, Tom Seaver never did that. A 7 WAR for 3 years in a row. Neither did Carlton. Neither did Nolan Ryan or anybody like that.
Yeah. See, now I have him in because of the 2,600 strikeouts and the 5 World Series. I also like that he had a Cy Young. I understand to the traditional baseball fan the less than 200 wins and the 3.46 ERA. That's not going to be appealing, but I really like the 5 World Series. I'll tell you that.
Okay, yeah. I mean, he again, it's kind of like Bernie. He was a key part of that. Another thing about David Cone, and I think the reason he's maybe viewed as a Hall of the Very Good type of guy, as opposed to Hall of Fame, is he was on a lot of good staffs, and he never was the guy you said, wow, he's the stud, he's the main horse, he's the stopper of that team. In his Mets days, he was in a rotation with Dwight Gooden, Ron Darling, Sid Fernandez, Frank Viola for a little while. Then in his Yankee days, of course, David Wells, Andy Pettitte, El Duque, and then Roger Clemens eventually. Cone was always kind of seen, I think, as one more good guy in that cog. It was almost a staff of aces, both with the 1980s Mets and the 1990s Yankees. And David Cone was kind of like one really nice cog in that machine. He wasn't really seen as the clear-cut main guy stopper on the staff. And I think that is a perception of him that kind of has underrated his actual statistics for his career, which I think are Hall of Fame worthy. I mean, if you take all the stuff that I've been mentioning, his strikeouts and the whip and the ERA and the WAR, and kind of put them in perspective of his era, he rates about even with Don Drysdale. He rates almost as good as Juan Marichal in all these. These are the guys I compare him to in the book, and it's kind of eye-opening to look at. I think it's because he was seen as kind of one cog in a machine, and because he pitched in a more modern era, he didn't have a lot of 20-win seasons. He only had a couple. 20-win seasons, reaching that number was not as common in his time as it was back in, say, Juan Marichal's time. I think that goes toward the perception that he was a, real nice pitcher, but not a Hall of Famer.
All right, Tom, I'll get you out on this. I know we've been talking for a long time. I just love Hall of Faming. The last chapter of your book contains quick snapshots of the Hall of Fame qualifications of other former Yankees and Mets. Now, you don't agree with everyone in that chapter, but I'd like you to go through the guys in that chapter who you think have the best claims for plaques in Cooperstown, if you can.
Okay, yeah, I go through a lot of names, some far back and some more recent, prominent Yankees and Mets. The guys who probably stand out, who I think have the best case, let's see, good question. I think of recent Yankees, I think Mark Teixeira is a yes. I think his career production, real quick, is basically on par with and a little better than some historic first basemen like Tony Perez, Orlando Cepeda, and a couple of others. I think Don Mattingly comes up short because his peak was too brief. A guy who got almost no support, got a handful of votes, and was one and done, but who I think should be not only have more consideration, but should be in the Hall of Fame is Johan Santana. And I know he wasn't a long-time career Met. He did most of his damage with the Minnesota Twins, but he was a prominent Met for a few years after he got there, so I went ahead and included him. Johan Santana, from 2003 to 2008, had a 6-year run that was almost as good, not quite, but almost as good as the one Sandy Koufax had from 1961 through 66. Sandy Koufax is in the Hall of Fame strictly because of that great 6-year run he had when he was almost superhuman. Sandy Koufax, though, had no if you know baseball history, I'm sure you're kind of familiar with Koufax's career. He came up very young.
Question.
He was a bonus baby. Early in his career, he didn't really have his control. Then he found his control, and he was almost superhuman for the next 6 years. And then all of a sudden, he had an arthritic elbow, which forced him out of the game at age 30.
One of the biggest what-ifs in baseball history. How great could he have been if he didn't get hurt?
And yet he still made it easily into the Hall of Fame because people said, all right, he only had that peak for 6 years, but the 6 years was so awesome that, you know what, he makes it anyway. The peak the peak was not only, terrific, it was exceptional. It stands on its own, right? That's how good it was. Well, Johan Santana had almost as good. You look at where he is compared to Koufax, and I do this in the book, ERA, WHIP, and so forth, and how he compares to league average. Johan Santana is equal to Koufax. Koufax is better in strikeouts by a pretty good margin. That's where he has the edge, which translates to a WAR edge. Koufax in his run averaged 7.8, just amazing. But for his part, Santana in his 6-year run averaged a 6.6. So there's an edge in Koufax's favor, but not by a ton. But here's the other part. Johan Santana, in addition to his big 6-year run, had 3 other years that were quite good, that were either all-star or just about at all-star level. So you compare each guy's big 6-year run, Koufax is a little bit better, but Santana also had 3 more good years that were better than any other year Koufax had. So you sort of balance the scale with that, and their career numbers are virtually identical to each other. I mean,
that's a great point.
Santana,
that's a great point with Santana.
He only lasted 12 years, but career WAR about 53. I mean, the guy had a run from 19, in particular, a 3-year run, 2004, 5, and 6. He won 2 out of 3 Cy Young awards and should have won the 3rd one. Bartolo Colon beat him out for some God knows why reason in that particular year. But he was, in terms of the major category, ERA plus, fielding independent pitching, WHIP, strikeout per 9, everything. Johan Santana was number 1 in the American League in every one of those categories in all 3 of those seasons. I mean, and I think over the 3 years he went 55 and 19. If you want to look at his win-loss record, he was just he was just unreal for a period of time. And I know he doesn't quite have the lifetime totals because he had the injuries with the Mets and he retired after 12 years. But I think his peak is exceptional enough, along with the other 3 good years, to the point where he's comparable to at least a handful of pitchers who were in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that's a great point. I was going to say I disagree with Johan Santana, but, boy, I'll tell you, that's a great point with Koufax. That's a great point, Tom. You may have convinced me there. You may have.
The main thing is to get people to maybe think about it a little bit, say, no, this guy was a good player, but I don't think of him as a Hall of Famer. If, my hope is if the book just, maybe says, if it spurs some people to look at a guy a little more closely, even if in the end they still don't agree with my take, which is fine. If it gets people talking a little bit, and who knows, maybe one day in the near future, I mean, if Greg Nettles winds up on the Hall of Fame, or or Johan Santana or Keith Hernandez or any of these guys. And and the fact that I put this book out there could have had something to do with it, to getting the conversation going. Not that I think that's going to happen, but
it could.
If it does, I mean, if it's out there and some people read it, and some people who actually have power over these things, people who have votes, start to maybe take a closer look, and it ultimately yields something, then I'll be really happy about that.
All right, Tom. Thank you for your time.
Jacob, thank you. It was great to talk to you.
All right, that was Tom Van Riper. His book is New York Loves Them, Cooperstown Snubs Them, Great Mets and Yankees Who Belong in the Hall of Fame. Thanks for listening. Here comes the outro.
Thanks for the plug, Jacob from the past. It does mean a lot. I gotta say one thing about that interview. And I don't mean to toot my own horn here or pat myself on the back, but I think that was a great exchange of differing viewpoints. Disagreements in this country have become yelling and name-calling. And that's wrong. It's okay to have a different viewpoint than someone else and not think they're Hitler. How many times, whether it's sports or politics, have we seen two different sides just point the finger at each other and call each other bad names? They're stupid, they don't know what they're talking about, they're idiots, blah, blah, blah. That's wrong. Hear the other person out. It's okay to disagree, but do it civilly. Civil discourse. My favorite moment of that interview wasn't the Nettles point with the batting average. It wasn't the Cano Cabrera war moment. It was when I asked Tom if I was being fair to him. And he said yes. That meant the world to me. A lot of times when you disagree with someone and you're passionate about the topic, you can resort to name-calling. I've certainly done it in the past, but I've made a clear and concerted effort to not do that on this show. I've made a clear and concerted effort to not do that in my personal life. Am I perfect in that regard? Absolutely not. But I think it's something that we can all strive to. Disagree with someone, but not think they're the worst person on earth, or an idiot, or whatever. Tomorrow, the NFL rumors will get crazier. The day of the draft, there are always crazy rumors. I mean, that was when we learned that the Chiefs were going to take Eric Fisher over Luke Jokel, and the Browns were going to take Baker Mayfield over Sam Darnold. Maybe the Bengals throw a crazy curveball and choose to take Justin Herbert over Joe Burrow. Maurice Jones-Drew will be right. I don't see anything like that happening, but I do expect some curveballs thrown. Gonna be a lot of fun. Until tomorrow, I am Jacob Valk saying that they should name a baseball glove after me.